Perfect. All right. Hey guys, it's the Fight Nutritionist, and today I'm here with my man Tony Ricci, who has been such a big influence in me and my career, one of my biggest supporters. He's been in the fight game for over 20 years. He's coached several world champions. You know, he's the professor, he's the researcher, and he's the coach. So Tony really knows his shit. Has wrote some really great papers on creatine specifically for combat athletes, which is what we're going to kind of talk about today. But Tony, if you want to introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background so people can kind of get to know you a little bit better if they don't know you already.
Okay, Jack. Thanks, TFN. Good to be here and chat about two things we love, right? Which is MMA, fight sports is a bigger umbrella than just MMA, and the great supplement creatine. My background is I've been doing this a very long time and very lucky. I've really had great fortune because I've always been with great people. Academically, I have, I think it's 5 degrees now. An undergrad degree in health science and a couple of masters, one in sports sci, ex-phys, the other's in nutrition, a science doctorate in nutrition, and then sports psychology, doctorate of sports psychology. So I try to cover all facets of human performance, and it's exciting, it's fun. And as a result of it, we get to share good information like we have today and talk about this wonderful molecule called creatine.
So obviously we've been talking a lot, and I reference your review paper quite a bit when I'm trying to explain, the importance of creatine for combat athletes specifically. And we all know the great benefits of creatine: increased strength, increased power, improves lean mass, things like that. But obviously there are some concerns of it when it comes to combat sports specifically, since it is a weight class sport. But I kind of wanted to ask you, because not every time is a supplement always appropriate for an athlete. It's always, got to tackle it on an individual basis. So, in your experience, how do you kind of implement creatine with your fighters? How do you have that conversation? And kind of what's your method? Do you go straight for the loading protocol that people typically do? Or is it better that you think in your mind for combat athletes to kind of just stick with the 5 to 10 grams a day, just start with that maintenance dose?
And I think that's an important question, Jackie, and I think it's still debated to an extent, but as it pertains to MMA or any fight sport, boxing, kickboxing, wrestling, where weight is going to be a factor, there are some, considerations there. And how much weight people put on is obviously going to vary according to, we still think, what is their natural creatine storage, maybe the predominant fiber type they have. But one of the things I think that is important to look at, Jack, is that in that paper that you're referencing, Dr. Darren Kandau and Dr. Scott Forbes have done so much great work in creatine research. And because now we feel creatine really does not have to be cycled, right? It is something that we can use with a long-term, or prophylactically, if you will, long-term administration. So my point there is I'm less inclined to load with creatine in the beginning phases with an athlete, unless they were on short notice for an event. So if you have somebody that somehow was invited to the combine, as an example, a football combine on short notice, we want to immediately try to load and get those creatine stores up. But when you have an athlete that is training year-round, and of course the intensities vary, and they have this concept of a long-term career in fighting, hey, I'll be doing it for the next 5 or 6 years, I generally don't load, because we find now that this is a supplement, a molecule that has so many health benefits, we don't have to come off of it, right? So I don't feel the sense of urgency. I kind of like taking creatine in the 5 to 10 grams and utilizing it over long-term because of all the benefits. Plus, what that may do is, to a large extent, just kind of mitigate how much weight gain occurs because of that type of dosing. So one of the things I think is important, Jackie, is to be attuned. If you have the advantage of working with a fighter like 12 weeks out, start to creatine then if they haven't used it, so we can start seeing if oh my gosh, they put on 5 pounds over 2 to 3 weeks, or wow, they only put on 2 pounds. And then we're cognizant of how much weight was added, and then whether or not they may have to titrate later. But I think one thing to keep into consideration too is a lot of the research shows that over time, creatine really does, while it promotes lean mass, it may produce a reduction in body fat. So there could be a positive trade-off in weight, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If I put on 2 or 3 pounds, right, of water, intramuscular water, or some weight in lean tissue, actually hard lean tissue weight, and I've lost a pound or 2 of fat, we may be offsetting that.
Okay. So you mentioned kind of this titration, and you mentioned it in your paper too about how you don't necessarily need to cycle off of creatine completely when it comes to, making weight, because there is that concern with the fighters of the intramuscular water storage and the increase in water weight that they think, is going to have an effect when it comes to making weight. So how do you go about titrating that down, and what have you observed, with that method with your fighters, in terms of how that has minimized any weight retention at all?
I think that I generally titrate because for the positive, so for example, it really depends how close the athlete is, right?
Yeah.
So if this athlete is really looking good, so it's a week out and they've got to lose 9 pounds, and that may sound like a lot, or 8 pounds, but it's not that much on 185, a person trying to fight middleweight. They can sweat out 8 pounds if they wanted to in an hour.
Yeah.
Right. However, if we see the athlete seems to be behind, so a lot of it, Jackie, is looking at where are we. So if this athlete has not done their homework with your type of dietary prescription and protocol, and they haven't been eating well and adhering to their overall practice, training much as we want, and we see that they're a little behind 2 weeks out, then I'm going to consider titration more than I would if this athlete is really looking like they're on target. Because the fact is, yes, it holds a lot of intramuscular water, but that water is quite disposable, right? So creatine is putting that water in the muscle and helping glycogen to be stored in there potentially, or helping to resynthesize it. But if that athlete is on target, I may just take a little creatine dip. So if they were doing in the range of 5 to 8 grams, about 8 to 10 days out, maybe a little more depending upon where they are, I may bring it down to 3 grams, 2 grams, a maintenance level. And we also know that the benefits of the creatine are still going to be advantageous over probably a 1 to 2 week course, even if we cut it completely, right? So again, how much, whether or not we need to cut it, is not really conclusive until we see where our athlete is. If they're in great position, we know we're going to be able to turn the water over, even some of that intramuscular water. If they're behind, unfortunately, then we may have to say, oh gosh, we're going to have to pull this creatine, because I got to use every measure I can to get them there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't think it's something to say just automatically, you have to pull your creatine before the fight. I think someone like Chris Algieri is very successful in using it very close right up to the fight.
Yeah.
Why? Because he's always on point with his body fat and his weight, right?
Yeah, and he's talked a lot about that before, about how he hasn't had to even cut it out at all. He can use it right up to weigh-in. So yeah, that's a good point. If your athlete's on weight, they don't have to cut that much. You can keep them on it. Whereas, maybe that 2 week period out, depending on where they are, is when you really have to evaluate whether you have to titrate that down.
Definitely, Jack. It's like anything else. Like how much, do we got to put them in a bath and skins, and plastics and run them from here to Nevada? Well, we might. Okay. It depends on where they are, right? So it's a big factor. So there's an art here, not just the science,
Yeah. One other thing I'd like to pick your brain about too is, so, obviously, sorry, we have a visit from Lana over here. Give me a second.
Good. Always good.
So obviously, creatine, can increase lean mass. And when it comes to fighting, when we're kind of planning out these guys' weight cuts, we kind of always factor in maybe about 1 to 2 pounds of muscle loss during that period, just with how active they are, the calorie deficit. So in terms of we have an athlete on creatine during this time, do you think they're really even able to build muscle? Like, would creatine even help build that lean mass, or maybe just preserve that muscle mass loss?
Yeah,
Like,
wonderful
with that, like,
question.
what would that really be a factor? How would that kind of play in? Because then, my thoughts are that I don't think creatine would really help build that much lean tissue during a weight cut. If anything, maybe just kind of preserve the lean tissue they would normally lose in that time.
I think that's a wonderful thought. And I think it'd be right now, I don't think we could say conclusively, but rationally, if we look at it, the bigger the caloric cut, the more lean tissue we're going to lose, right? So you start like hacking calories in the last 3 weeks by 50%, you might have a 60% of that loss immediately being lean tissue. Well, I think your point is well taken, that one of the wonderful things about combining the creatine, utilizing it strategically in a low chronic dose, over a long time with proper protein intake and proper protein manipulation. I think if we do that, we really have a greater propensity to hold that lean tissue, to your point. And that's what we want. Hold on to that lean tissue, because if we lose substantive amounts, well, then we're losing a lot of the medium through which we're going to apply all the skills that we worked on all camp, right?
Yeah.
So losing too much lean tissue is a loss of power. It's a loss of speed. It may be a loss of neuromuscular and cognitive reaction times. So therefore, even if creatine were, and I believe it's certainly going to help, was supporting the preservation of that tissue during caloric restriction, that would be wonderful. That would be, and I believe that would be its primary role, and something that it could really help do during that time. So, yep, because it's still signaling all the mechanisms, whether it's, mTOR or intramuscular water volume, which signals recovery to an extent, or hypertrophy. Even if we're not getting the effect of hypertrophy, which was not our primary goal, we probably are getting some positive responses to helping that lean tissue recover and be preserved. Yep.
Which is what essentially we want with these guys, right? This is the recovery aspect of it. So then I guess, my next question leading into that, and I've kind of talked to Dr. Antonio about this, is, in those special cases, and I've chatted about it with you with some of my fighters, is when these guys make the decision to drop down a weight class, and, we do our testing and we kind of realize that we need to sacrifice a significant amount of lean tissue, would the use of creatine, even in small amounts, be counterproductive to doing that? In that case, would it not be an appropriate supplement for the athlete, since we're trying to kind of, I guess, get rid of more lean mass, or would it still be beneficial to kind of help with the recovery? So, in your opinion, what would you kind of do in that situation if someone were to ask you about that?
Yeah, I think that this is the importance, if we can, Jackie, under optimal conditions, of knowing, maybe 10 weeks out, how much weight did they put on? I think, like we were referencing Chris Algieri, so not everybody's going to get that high volumizing of cellular fluid, that I may get, and the osmolarity effects may not be as drastic. So I think it's really contingent upon how much weight do we think they put on by that. Can we track that? If the fighter added 1 or 2 pounds from 5 grams of creatine, then I think we're okay even still, because you can titrate that down to 2 grams as they get closer to the fight, even attempting, to drop that weight class. Okay, so to your point, we have to scavenge. If we have to scavenge that much muscle tissue, I understand that a lot of people, and this is the obvious answer, and not everyone would adhere to it, but it probably isn't worth it, obviously, because we're going to lose the capacity for strength, speed, power, probably reaction time. Okay, but to my point there, creatine is not just for the periphery. It could help cognitive performance. So and keep the brain hydrated too, potentially. So my point there is, if there is a way that we can keep creatine integrated, even for the athlete that wants to push down that weight class, it would be wonderful, perhaps in those lower dosage. And that's where we would look to preserve it. and or I should say utilize it and preserve the lean tissue. So I don't, whenever we can keep it included based upon the neuroprotective benefits, potential TBI, right? Benefits, and the straight out strength and power benefits, we got to keep it there. You know, we've got to. If you see 3-4 weeks out that your fighter's on it and you are wondering how they're going to get there, okay, maybe we cut it for the extra 2 pounds. But someone like me, I put on, if I do 5 to 10 grams of creatine, 10 grams, I'm putting on 6 pounds.
Yeah.
Maybe 7. So I would have to titrate that. But if the person's putting on 1 or 2 pounds, maybe not as much, even if they're trying to extend it to, you know, an extreme cut to that lower class.
So you're suggesting that in that case, if that is the case where we have to, you know, drop a significant amount of weight and sacrifice a lot of lean tissue to have that athlete maybe on creatine for some, you know, a good amount of time before to evaluate what their response is to it before making the decision of whether you have to cut it or not.
Yes, exactly. And that's not always easy, because for the fighter that only puts on a couple of pounds, that may be a normal undulation anyway, right? I mean, but what the point to that is, if you have them, Jackie, 12 weeks out, let's say, which would be a miracle from some of us, right? Let's say 10 weeks to week 5, and you're seeing that their weight has been relatively stable in that time, well, then obviously creatine's probably not making a major contribution to weight gain. So to someone, like I said, with my body type, I'll lose an immediate 3 or 4 pounds if I stop using it.
Yeah.
So it would probably be helpful for my body type to pull it. But if that person's putting on a pound, maximum 2, we may be able to just cut it and still have them arrive there effectively. But knowing, you know, the one thing that's always a problem is trying to figure things out 2 weeks out. I mean, no, let's see if we can get a history and try these things 10 weeks out and see where that puts us. And creatine would also be a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So overall, you know, I guess I always recommend it. I'm sure you do too. Creatine is beneficial for fighters. It's not something that they need to worry about when it comes time for the weight cut. Shouldn't, you know, add too much water weight, but there are things that they can do to kind of minimize that effect if it's something that they're worried about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things you can do is creatine is offering so much benefit if we're doing, you know, if the fighter's moving down nicely and the key thing is this, you know, it's if you know what your athlete's lowest body fat or around, Jackie, that they can perform at and still perform optimally. Let's say you have a history with a fighter and their last fight they went to about 9%. And they fought brilliantly there, and now they're at 11 or 12. Well, you want to get them there, because if you, on a 185-pound fighter, you know, 3% it's 5 more pounds of fat. That's a lot, right? So my point to it is, if you can make a very good trade-off, and the fighter that's dedicated, if they pull the fat they don't need, through good dietary practice, good recovery practice, good training, they're more inclined to be able to keep the creatine even during the pull.
Yeah.
So, and yes, if we can keep it there, the benefits are too numerous for us to rid it. They just are. You know, it's something you want to attach. Look, I don't make any money on creatine, so.
I don't either, and it's our favorite supplement. We're like, just put it in the water.
Exactly. Just go research it and find out that it really does a lot of wonderful things, particularly for the athlete with enormous training volumes during camp and those that are having head trauma during camp.
Yeah.
An impact.
All right. Well, that's kind of all the questions I had for you. You want to add any last remarks, say anything?
Yeah, I guess we should add, Jackie, you know, there have been people for 30 years, maybe 35 years, making a concerted effort to prove creatine harmful, negative effects or cramping or issues with, you know, maybe long-term kidney, negative impacts on the kidney. And we just don't see it. Now, obviously, if somebody had a pre-existing kidney issue, of course, then you have to be careful, right? But, but that doesn't make creatine bad for you. It just makes it that, hey, maybe I cannot supplement with it. But again, I think in closing, dollar per dollar, this is a really wonderful supplement. And it isn't just for performance. It appears to be for health. So, for those of you out there who have any creatine questions, contact Jackie, learn more, because we're almost at a point where I don't know why you wouldn't take it.
Yeah, it's almost like all the benefits. There's no negative effects, side effects to it. So
it.
it's all positive. So it's kind of like, it's an easy choice to make at that point. And it's cheap. It's not expensive. I mean,
exactly.
My creatine, I bought a whole tub of it on Amazon for like $15.
And it's a monohydrate, right?
Yeah. So
yep.
It's not.
Yep. Important notation: monohydrate being as good as any other kind.
Yep.
And very cost effective.
Exactly. Well, Tony, thank you so much for hopping on today. I always love chatting with you and learning from you. And, you're my biggest fan, so I always appreciate that.
I am a big fan of TFN all the way, the Fight Nutritionist. You're doing good work, Jack. I'm proud of you.
Where can people find you if they have questions for you or just want to follow you on social media?
Yeah, so I guess on Instagram is probably like my only social media forum. That's just my business name is Fight Shape, so it's easy. It's one word: FIGHTSHAPE. And right away, normally with that, my name comes up. It's like Fight Shape and my last name, Ricci. Or if they want to email, Tony@fightshape.net, Tony, Tony, @fightshape.net, and I'm always available to chat there.
Yeah. So for those of you guys, definitely give Tony a follow. He puts out some really great stuff. He'll be starting at Nova University pretty soon, so we'll have him local in Florida.
That means I'll be hanging with TFN more in Florida. Exactly. That's good.
Whatever coffee shop.
Actually, yes.
So I'm looking forward to it. But all right, thank you so much, Tony. I always appreciate you.
Great, Jack. Enjoy.